Okay, so I've sent the notes on the Zoom platform. We are doing a review on the study which was done by Elder Tess. So the title of that study, it's the Covenanters. So I just want to give a brief background to how this study came about. So before she brought this subject, she had already laid a structure of the three movements. If we are to open the notes, we'll see the line that she had drawn there. And the purpose of going back to that history, we know that the structure of the three movements explained a lot and clarified the context of the Millerite history, which we had never done in a very systematic or clear manner. And it is this structure that led us to see the two tests in the history of the Millerites, which is slavery and the issue of the Sabbath. So in trying to explain how those two tests came to be, she had introduced who are the players in that history which were driving behind this test. So that's when the subject of the Covenanters came in, to try and even go back to understand the roots or where the movement which was driving the test of slavery in 1863, where were they getting their influence from? And I would also recommend to even go after this study, she delved deeper into Calvinism, which others are going to do, to actually complete the thought of what she was explaining. So on the document that I've sent, from page 1, it begins with the review, which is actually a review of the previous test study she has done to introduce this subject. So I'm gonna skip page number 1 up to number 12. That's when she began to now establish this study about the Covenanters. So before we do that, we are going to do as we were doing the past weeks with the studies that Rasedi was doing. As we know that this subject becomes a parable. It's something that has happened in the history of the Millerites. And the purpose why we are going back to this study is that it's going to help us to understand the nature and the movements which are occurring in our time. So this becomes a reference point. So after we have done this review, we should be able to answer a few questions that can help us to have takeaways from each and every study that we would have gone through. So on the board, I've just put some few questions which I hope you can see in this corner. We need to be able to answer the question, what was the Covananters all about, and why? This may be pertaining to why this study was done. What is it that we can learn from this? And we need also to be able to answer, when did they come into history? And there is also another question, how? When this group played their part, how did it influence that history? And if this is going to repeat, how is it going to play out? And maybe we might need also to answer who. And when we look at this in our time, who do they represent? So we should be able to at least have specific answers to those few questions at the end of each subject that we would have studied. So before we start to go into this subject, I would want to ask, for those who have gone through this study before, maybe for some it will be the first time, is there anyone with thoughts or questions they might want to be covered on this subject? Anyone with a question or thoughts that they might have? And then we're gonna review it together. Okay, if there's none, so we are going to go to our notes, so we can open that document on our Zoom platform. And we are at page 12. So I'm just gonna read the statement there where she was introducing this subject. So the statement there says, then before going any further, we want to look at Calvinism, what it is. And this is just straight from, she was reading from a Wikipedia page. Remember, it's Calvinism that the two sides are fighting over. In this study, I want to address Calvinism and the Covenanters, so we get some background into where they come from and how they fit. So she's mentioning that at this point in time, when you go into the history of the Millerites, where the Covenanters come into play, let me just give some more information on also what was happening in the United States around 1861 to 1863. So I'm just gonna show you the line that so when you look at the board, I've put this line, it's already in your document. As you can see here, there is 1798, 1863 to the 1900. This is the first period where the first movement, which she's referring to. So if you check, this was already done before this study was done, where she was laying the group threat, which influenced the movement that was concerned or pushing for a Sunday law in this history. And when you notice, I've put North America there. If you sorry about that. Okay. So she's gonna explain that when this issue about these these threats or group threat is gonna become an issue in the history of the Millerites, the status or the state at which United States has been divided, it's in two steps. First, we know that before 1844, there was a fight within Protestantism. And mostly it was between the churches in the north and those ones in the south. And the subject which they were fighting over, it was mostly because of the issue of slavery. So by the time you come to 1863, she made the point that the South had already lost in this battle. And as we go into from 1863 to 1865, the Civil War, the Southern churches actually failed to make any positive impact. So the group that is gonna now be fighting, it's within or among the northern churches. This is where now there's one group which is already portraying the image that there's a threat which the government in place is gonna treat the Protestants as a minority, as like there's a church and state which has been done. And this is the threat they are going to try and fight. So that's when she mentioned, or she made the statement that what was causing, or what was the cause of these two groups fighting. When you look at what I've illustrated here, it was now the conservative versus the liberals in the north. They were fighting over or they were divided by this concept, which its origin, it's in the theology of Calvinism. So without understanding Calvinism, we cannot even talk about Covenanters. So we're just gonna briefly touch the origins or of the theology of Calvinism, which will take us back to the history of Reformation. So if you look here, I've put just the line above. There is the history of Reformation there in the 1500s, which goes all the way to the 1730s and 1780s when the first Great Awakening happened. And if you look there, I've put a statement there. For us to understand Calvinism, we need to understand where did it begin. And I've put a statement there. There was war within Protestantism during the time of Reformation. So as you can see, what we want to understand is this fight which is happening within Protestantism. And it's similar to what happened in this history. And the two main players which made an impact in the history of the Reformation, it's Lutheranism and Calvinism. These are the two main Protestant figures and originators of two doctrines, or one doctrine which ended up creating a division. So we just want to briefly understand what was the theology which became Calvinism, or became the basis or the foundation of Protestantism, the one which they were fighting over in this history. So I'm just gonna go on to the Wikipedia page. So the Wikipedia page that she was referring to, this issue began in the history of Reformation. So it was the idea or the subject of the two kingdoms. It ended up being called the two kingdom doctrine. If you go on Wikipedia and just type two kingdom doctrine Calvinism, this is the definition it gives. The two kingdom doctrine is a Protestant Christian doctrine that teaches that God is the ruler of the whole world, and that he rules in two ways. The doctrine is held by Lutherans and represents the view of some Calvinists, which were led by John Calvin. But it's mentioned that John Calvin actually is significantly modified. So this theology of two kingdoms was first taught by Martin Luther. So if you scroll down, well, let's say you are on Wikipedia, it will define what Luther was saying when it comes to this doctrine. So according to the two kingdom doctrine, the spiritual kingdom made up of Christians does not need the sword. The biblical passages dealing with justice and retribution, therefore, are only in reference to the first kingdom. Luther also uses this idea to describe the relationship of the church to the state. He states that the temporal kingdom has no authority in matters pertaining to the spiritual kingdom. So in other words, Martin Luther is saying, yes, there are two kingdoms, but one is spiritual. And the one that is temporal, it's the one that has the civil arm on earth. So with this spiritual kingdom, he's saying it has no authority to deal with any matters that pertains the state. So in other words, Martin Luther is the one who came with this idea of separation of what? Of church and state, if we can see from this statement. So we want also to visualize what was the imagery in Luther's mind when we talk of church and state. How did he view this? And remember, Luther in his period, there is already the issue which he's fighting against, which is Catholicism, which had caused so much persecution of the Christians using the arm of the state. So his doctrine, it's a response to that. So we want to see how Martin Luther was viewing this. So in his definition, the church must be separate. It must not have anything to do with the things of the state. So on the board, I've put an illustration, which I'm gonna use to show what the Protestants in the time of Reformation were viewing. So John Calvin comes, he did not come up with a new theology. He significantly modified what Luther had done. So we want to understand what were the modifications which were done to what Luther believed, and what was the impact or the effects of these changes. So if you look, I've put an illustration there. I hope we can see where I've put the church on the left and the state on the right, and there's a wall in the middle. So on this image, according to what Calvin was saying, these kingdoms are equal, but this is not what Luther was saying. So you see there is Christ above, the church on the left, state on the right. According to Martin Luther, there mustn't be any overlapping of these two kingdoms and influencing each other. But Calvin is saying these two kingdoms can actually work together. So I'm gonna come back to this after we have finished explaining what Calvin was saying. So we go back to the Wikipedia page. So according to Calvin, the two kingdoms he modified it. Later, it was even called Neo-Calvinism, which most Protestant churches have adopted. And they've changed the name even when you look at Elder Test notes, she actually mentioned that most Protestants today, they don't call themselves Calvinists. They run away from that title. Some, they call themselves Reformed Protestantism. Whenever you see the title with Reformed, they are just, it's a hint to show you that whatever it's Reformed, it's the doctrine which originated with Calvin. So if you are to search today to want to understand this subject, you might not find Calvinism in their definitions, but they use this title. So some different churches are now calling this a transformationism. So if you are on Wikipedia, transformationism is highlighted. You can open there. It has got the explanation of what it is. So this idea in Judaism and Christianity, some other Abrahamic religions, it's the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, referred to as culture mandate. In some denominations of Christianity, is the divine injunction found in Genesis 1:28. Sorry, I was just muting the mic. So they go to Genesis 1:28, the command which was given to Abraham to multiply and be fruitful. So they take this as a mandate from God. Already you can see that by this reference, it implies that if they go to the Old Testament and look at the beginning of ancient Israel, they want to take this theory in literal terms. And this is an argument which is happening during Reformation. So Martin Luther is saying the kingdom of God, it's now spiritual. It's just temporarily on earth for a period of time, but this is not its permanent location. So Calvin has a different view. So already you can see from their two definitions that Martin Luther is pushing for the church to lay off its hands on the state, and already he's condemning what Catholicism has been doing. This is what has brought persecution. But Calvin's response brings a different picture, which means Protestants, right from the history of Reformation, has an idea that there has to be two kingdoms on earth. And these two kingdoms, when they give this reference of the story of Abraham, it takes you back to the history of how church and state was put together by God, and they have to work together. So there we can actually see that there is a problem in this theology. So let's just read further to understand the context of what this can do. So in Genesis 1:28, in which God, after having created the world and all in it, ascribed to humankind the task of filling, subduing, ruling over the earth. The culture mandate includes the sentence, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The culture mandate was even given Adam and Eve. So they go back and reference this to Genesis 1 and 2, that this is the same mandate which was given to Adam and Eve, to have control. So in this theology, there is church and state has the command or the mandate to control and to rule. So we just going to go back to the image that I've shown to see how Calvinists believe this is going to work. But I just want to read a few statements that we can see. So the text finds an immediate interpretation in the opening chapter of the book of Exodus, as the description of Israelites in Egypt are alluded to as fruitful, increased greatly, multiplied, and extremely strong, so that the land was filled with them. So in Orthodox, the mandate to be fruitful and multiply is interpreted as requiring every couple to have at least a son and a daughter. Other Jewish groups, such as Reform Judaism and individual Jews, have interpreted this mandate differently. For example, Richard Friedman, in his commentary on the Torah, claims that the mandate to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth has been fulfilled. So it is actually interpreted differently by different groups, but this is the reference point which Calvinism is coming with. So this leads us to now our subject, which is the Covenanters. So at least I think now we have seen the difference with what Luther was teaching and what Calvinism brought. So in the history of Reformation, what was being taught by Calvin became popular. This became the popular idea. And when you come down to the history of the Millerites, the doctrine that was inherited by Protestants in the United States, it is what John Calvin taught against, or that is why Lutheranism did not have so much impact when you come to the history of Protestantism in America. And that is why I want us to see the difference of what the reformers had in mind as they were responding to the persecution and what Catholicism had done. So I just want confirmation. Are we all together at this point? Is there anyone whom I've lost? Are we following?
Yes, we are following, Milton.
All right, great. So we're gonna go back to our notes. How Covenanters came to be is that in the history of Reformation, it was not only John Calvin who was the reformer. There are many other reformers who are in that history. Some were operating from different locations. So there was another reformer who was a follower of, I can say, who was interested with the theology that John Calvin was teaching, among others, on this idea of the two kingdoms. And this was John Knox. So John Knox, he's the one who is going to be the leader of the Presbyterian group that was in Scotland. So he actually made a visit, come and sit down with John Knox to get a clear idea of what he was teaching. So I'm just looking for the page where that was referenced. Yeah, so if you go on page 19, it says, as we are trying to understand now Calvinism, how it is in connection with the Presbyterians, that's where the covenant or the Covenanters came in. So she was going to give a reference of what happened on how John Calvin and is it Calvin and Knox met. So it says, Presbyterianism, John Calvin is in Europe, and one day he receives a visitor, John Knox. Now John Knox is coming from Scotland, and he likes what he hears from Calvin. He takes that theology, he brings it back with him to Scotland. It's from Scotland that Presbyterianism developed through the theology of Calvinism, but really developed from John Knox. So John Knox is going to become a representative of Calvinism in Scotland. He's going to take this theology and work with that theology in the political space of Scotland. So there are other people involved, but the church in Scotland takes the name Presbyterian. So they did not call themselves Calvinists. They call themselves Presbyterians. But the founding theology that they are going to base their arguments on is the one of Calvin. So for us to understand how this theology came to be and what it looks like, we want to see how Knox applied, or how he understands this is going to work. So we want to look at, there are some documents which are going to be published by the Presbyterians as they are defining what they understand to be the relationship between the church and the state. So they will publish these documents, reform them, edit some. So there are two documents which are going to be edited in that history. So we just want to understand the first idea that they came up with. So there's a document which in this study Elder Tess has shared, I think it's referenced on the notes if people want to get a clear picture. So the subject is the issue of church and state in the early republic. And the Covenanters' radical critique. So the document starts with, okay, she's going to reference the page. So the issue they were discussing is this. I'm just going to read. I'm on page 21. It began with the long struggle between the two principles of church and state relations in Scotland. This long struggle began in 1560s, right back in the Reformation. There was two branches developing in Presbyterianism, which we will get to. But early on in their history, they are quite united. And what the Presbyterians were teaching back in the 1500s and 1600s was the doctrine of two kingdoms, the equality and the mutual independence of church and state. Now, all that sound good until you look at the fine print. So that is the document they are going to publish to make their statement. This is what they believe in. So the Presbyterian have two fundamental documents. The first document is in 1638 called the Scottish National Covenant. So this is where this title of this study was taken from. So what they are saying is that they are giving their stand to how they view church and state. And this is what they would wish the state can adopt. So we can hear from the title, the Scottish National Covenant. So this is a covenant between who and who. As we saw that from Calvin, they've adopted this doctrine from the Old Testament. And we know that the story that they went to, it's in Genesis. God made a covenant with who? With Abraham. In this covenant, these two institutions have to work together according to their understanding. So we want to explore how are these two institutions going to work together. So we know there are some differences which they might have been aware of. If you look at how it worked with Abraham and how it's going to work with the Protestants, it's going to be different, but the principle, they get it from there. So what the document stated was a pledged support for Presbyterian Church of Scotland against the Stuart King's effort to subjugate it to state rule and Anglicanism. So Presbyterianism is fighting for freedom for state based on their understanding of two kingdoms, the equality and mutual independence of church and state. So if you go to that document which Elder Tess is referencing and look at the full definition and the details, you are going to see that the pledge of Knox is to the state, that the state must not try to subjugate the church. The state must recognize the church as an equal counterpart in this system of governance. And there has to be mutual independence between the two. So this idea has actually been radically challenged even in that history. And it caused a division within Presbyterianism. Came out Reformed Presbyterian. Reformed Presbyterians, in the present terms, we can call them the mainstream, the ones who a bit compromises. So after the mainstream, you come to Covenanters. Covenanters actually are a third group which come out of this fraction. So if we are to identify them in the present terms, like they are the far, I can say the far right of that argument within Presbyterianism. They are the ones who are fundamentalists, who wants to go back to the original doctrines and stand on the ancient path. So they are the fundamentalist ones who are like more conservative than these other two groups. So they want church and state to be two equal counterparts working together. And in this context, according to Presbyterians, in their history, there is already other religions like Anglicans, which were influencing the government. They are not recognizing any church to be in this relationship. They've got a specific church they want to represent. And according to their documentation or their fine print, they believed it is them who has the right to be the ones who work with the government. So it's not any group that they believe can be in this relationship. So I just want us to note that. So we're going to come back to this image that I said will come back on the board. So can you see there where there is church and state and there's a wall in the middle? And they believe these kingdoms must be equal. As we have stated that if we are to think of what was in the reformers' mind, this is a response to the issue which had caused persecution in their history. What is it that they were running away from? So by the side of this, I've put, this was the Catholic system. We have church over the state. So you see there the Pope Catholic Church above. You've got the 10 kingdoms, they're the kings of Europe, which is believed to be, we can call this the image of the beast according to great controversy. So what I want us to note is that if you look at this imagery, I want us to visualize how the Protestants were viewing the correction of this. This was their response. So their response is that these two institutions on earth, they've got a covenant which they have to agree on. And this covenant is that they are going to rule and subdue together. But they operate independently. So in their view, we need to ask questions. How is God going to be communicating with these two institutions? And we know that if they claim that their leader is God or Christ who is in heaven, there is no channel of communication between Christ and the state. So how is he going to communicate? So they believe God speaks through the church, through the prophets, right? So that's when they establish their role in this relationship. So if Christ can speak with the church, what is it that they want to communicate, or how are they going to take part in their relationship with the state in this imagery? So one thing that they've done, which is different from what Martin Luther did, when they look at the state, Elder Tess used the words, they gave the state personality, or they personified the state. They treat the state as a human representative entity. So in other words, when you go back to the story of Abraham and you come to ancient Israel down the line, when the state is being addressed, God does not call Israel as he personified it, he called it as a human being. When you look at the sins that the nation committed, God is going to judge them as a nation. So once you personify the state, there is the issue of morality, which has to be addressed, cancelled, even rebuked. So reformers believe that for this to work, this is where the church has to come in. The church is not going to be working in the government, but they will be there to watch and observe. If things are not going well, they warn the state, just as God could speak through the prophets to warn the kings in history of ancient Israel. So that's why you see I've put an arrow there from Christ going to the church. So this is how they viewed how this relationship is going to work. And they believe the state has no right to subjugate the church because it has to be there. It is needed to be there. So once we have understand this imagery, we haven't explained its complications according to the way it's going to be implemented. So this became an established foundation for Protestants in most areas in Europe. And this is the idea that John Knox wanted to apply to England. He wants the church, the state to recognize the church and have a mutual relationship where the church has its right to lead when it comes to matters of spirituality and morality. And the state has to work or to control the civility of the state. But they have to work on equal grounds. And they have the right to existence, all of them. Unlike what Martin Luther was saying, there mustn't be any overlap. The state has nothing to do with the church. So in a basic primary sense, this is the argument which, when we come now to the history of the Millerite, this is what is happening in North America from 1861 going forward. The conservatives and the liberals have this idea. So when we now come to the history of the United States, as we know that we spoke about this the theology of two kingdoms, starting from Luther and then adopted by Calvin, modified. Another reformer came, which was Knox, took this idea and did some test run in Scotland. We know that all these people, when this failed in most European countries, they came to United States as a place of sanctuary. So Presbyterians, it's one of the groups that came to United States. So they are part of this history. When you come to 1860, they are part of this history. And as there was this division among Protestants about how they were responding to the Constitution which was established in the United States, we look at the argument, especially on the issue of slavery. When Ellen White responds to that issue, she called the issue of slaves as a crime against humanity, and God was going to judge United States for committing that crime, allowing that crime to occur. If you look at Presbyterians, Covenanters theology in this history, Protestants who were radical, they were not seeing that history that way. They were blaming what was happening to the state through the Constitution. They were saying the sin is not slavery. The sin is actually the Constitution, which has not recognized the church. So Presbyterians in this history, managed actually to gather a group of Protestant churches together. This is where they came with this movement, the National Reform Movement. They were trying to deal with the issue of how church and state was separated in the United States. And as we have seen from the history of Reformation, nothing much has changed in their view. If United States is to become a kingdom according to this theology, there has to be an equal recognition of state and church. And they were perceiving that this has to be the imagery. And when you look at this idea in the history of the Millerites, their agenda was to amend the Constitution. So you see, I've put amendment there. They want the state to make it clear that United States is what is a Christian. This is where the argument about America being a Christian nation, this is where it was coming from. So among other things, in those amendments, they would want religious laws, which in something they've actually gained those, or they've achieved those agendas. Like whenever the president takes oath of office, we know they swear with the Bible. It came through their influence. They also wanted amendments in relation to anything that can be said that is blasphemous to be taken action upon. So they want blasphemy laws that would avoid anything that can be said against the state. So we know that this was going to be the issue of the Sunday law in this history. If we are to look at our line there, 1863 to the 1900, the agenda of the National Reform Movement was to amend the Constitution. But we know that this failed. And through the Civil War and coming after the Civil War, we know that this movement suffered some great losses. They were not able to achieve all they wanted to. And then they tried again. And as we now go further with this line, we know that they are now represented by the evangelicals. So just from what we have shown so far, we also see that the issue of wanting to amend, even the issue of the threats that influence the need for these changes, it's something that have been progressively changing when we move to different dispensations. So when you look at the stand which they were taking in relation to the Constitution, if we go with the idea which Knox tried to implement in Scotland, when this covenant is established between the church and the state and God, with Presbyterianism, this extreme group, which are Covenanters, like the fundamentalists of Presbyterianism, there are many groups that are representing Protestants in the United States then and now. If you are to apply this principle to the fullest, it was not going to be any group like that would be the ones that have the right to like be part of this covenant. It has to be a selected group. And why the emphasis on a selected group? Part of the theology of Calvinism, or one of the complications that most liberal groups don't agree with, is the issue of predestination. When you look at Abraham's call, it was not by human choice. It was not even upon himself to say he agrees or not. When God called Abraham, it was already predetermined in God's will that he is the one to fulfill that duty of representing him on earth. And through that history, we understand the Jews claim their right of existence and to be the ones who represent God through that. It's not like they have to be chosen or there has to be a human council to decide who has to represent who. So the idea of predestination was also weaved in this theology. So which means when this group, which became Presbyterians, were influencing the state in Scotland, they believed they were predestined by God to take that role. And it is their duty to make themselves recognized and be part of that relationship. When you come now to this history of United States, it becomes more complex because there are more groups which are involved, some which have more influence. And to try and understand how was that going to work, it was a lot. That is why when Elder Tess was reviewing this history, to just come up with a Sunday law which puts even Sunday as a day of worship was not good enough for this group to have achieved all that they wanted. There was a lot to be put in place for them to have come to a point where they have control or dominate other groups. So this helps us to understand now when the evangelicals adopted this theology, they did not take the name Covenanters, but they've used different terminologies like Reformed Protestantism. When you see any group in the Protestant circles calling themselves Reformed Protestants, they are the fundamentalists who adopted this theology from Calvin. And this view of two kingdoms has never changed. They still believe if there has to be a government on earth that God is happy with, it is this what we have been showing. So this is where the evangelicals get their theology from. So when we now go back to those questions that I've put on the board, at this point, I think we'll be able to answer a few of them. The first one, which have put what was the subject that they were fighting over. The issue that was at hand here was the issue of how church and state has to operate. And when we go on the those notes that I've shared, if you go right at the top of that PDF, it shows now the theme or the subject that was being discussed, which is Protestantism. And we have seen where Protestantism got their basic or their base theology, which they were like operating on. And we know that they are going to try and achieve their work in 3 steps. And the first 2 attempts in trying to establish their theology, it has actually been a failure. And we know that the reason why we were taken back to this is that the last movement parallels with God raising his church. And based on the structure that if God's church on earth, which is Adventism, has also gone through 3 steps. And the first 2 attempts has been failure. There will be success at the end. In this study, it was to drive us to understand how is this movement gonna succeed, and what was the failure in the past. How did it play out in that history? And the other reason that we had to come back to this study, it also opened a clear picture of how we had a different picture when we look at Reformation. The way Adventists have portrayed the history of Reformation, we had seen our reformers as great heroes who sacrificed a lot, and we thought what we call today Protestantism, it's the same of what they were saying. But through what we have seen so far, the image that our reformers had in terms of how governance should be established on earth, it's not something that after this study we could agree on. So because of time, we are going to carry on with this in the afternoon. I just want us to end with this thought. When you look at the history of ancient Israel, we know that this is where this template of church and state was adopted. But after the first advent of Christ, we know that church and state was separated. And after this history, we have done the study of the counterfeit. When this history occurred, when we go through our study of the Great Controversy, we know that Satan had created a similar pattern which copied what God had done. Among the heathen or the pagan nations, there was this image also of church and state. So when this was separated after hundreds of years, we know that Satan produced another counterfeit, something that was similar. It looks similar, but it operated differently. So in this history of from the end of ancient Israel coming all the way to Reformation, we know that this counterfeit was also reproduced. This is where we see Catholicism coming into place. And the effects of this relationship, when this church and state was implemented in the counterfeit, it produced this bloody results of the Dark Ages and all that happened. So when the reformers are responding to this, we see that this is the image which was clear in their mind that this is not supposed to happen, where the church is above the state. They believe, even we also used to believe, that this is the abomination of desolation which was condemned through the prophecies of Daniel. And they would not want to repeat the same thing. But I want us to just think as we look at this image. I've just put a question mark there. If this was an abomination, church and state in this structure, and we know the specifics of the things that they were condemning, apart from a general assumption of which the Catholics, they all claim that they believe in God, they follow Christ, but the role which the Pope plays as a representative of Christ on earth, we know that there is something wrong with this structure, even if they want to make it look like similar to what Protestants believe in. So when we come to this image, where our reformers were responding to what had happened in this history, and this was the vision or the image of what they had in thought. And all the far-right groups in the evangelical circles today, some call themselves Reformed. They've adopted this theology from Calvin, modified from Luther, and also Knox coming with this idea that there is a covenant in the Old Testament between God and church and state. And they've even tried to do this in England. So when they come to United States, they want America also to make this covenant. They want United States to have this covenant established. So in the afternoon, we're gonna now try to see, at least we should have something to say about if this was an abomination and this was against God's will. I want us to think about this. What do we think of this image in terms of how it's gonna play out and what are the effects of this? So we'll end here. and then we'll come back in the afternoon and summarize our study. Is there anyone with any thoughts or questions before we close, and then we'll finish the trend of thoughts in the afternoon? Anyone who didn't get anything clear or any additions? Okay. So in the afternoon, I would greatly appreciate if all of us are back, just to have some thoughts on that image that I've shown. We need to be able to see and give some insight on what we think, what our reformers had in mind, what are the consequences of that. So let us close in prayer. Dear God who art in heaven, we thank you for your grace and your mercy as we are reviewing the history of the Millerites and also where they got their source of influence from the Reformation. Lord, we ask that you may continue to give us wisdom as we see that there's more to the founding principles that we inherited, some of the ideas that we thought were correct, and how we view your kingdom. As you lead us to have a clear picture of how we should understand the nature of your kingdom, we pray that we may continue to have the desire to understand these histories and have a clear picture of our duty and how we can be representative in this kingdom and also be those who lead and guide others into your kingdom. As we are breaking now, we pray that we'll meet in the next session, and we thank you for those who have been able to join and have clear network. We hope that that may continue. This is our humble prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So for those who have children, I think there's a children's class coming from Elder Gracious. She will take over.